Please leave a comment where you are watching from. They had warned me about room 314 on my first night at Bellevue. The senior nurses were sitting around the break room table, trading stories like campfire tales, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Don't ever pull a night shift there alone," one of them said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Strange things happen in that room." I couldn't help but laugh inside, superstitious nonsense. I was new, eager to prove myself, and the idea of a haunted hospital room seemed like a hazing ritual more than actual advice. But when my turn came to cover the ICU night shift, I got 314. The halls were quiet that night, quieter than usual. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in an almost rhythmic pattern, and the air felt heavier somehow, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. My patient in 314 was Mr. Andrew Keller, a frail man in his late 70s with advanced COPD. He'd been intubated earlier that day and was sedated, his breathing labored even with the ventilator. I don't know why I felt uneasy as I entered the room for the first time. Maybe it was the oppressive silence within, or the way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, darker than they should have been. The monitors beeped steadily, their green and blue lights casting faint glows on Mr. Keller's pale face. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the corner, just beyond the edge of the light. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Elena," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. It was probably just nerves. I hadn't worked a full night shift in a while, and exhaustion could play tricks on the eyes. I busied myself checking vitals, adjusting the 4-drip, and making sure everything was in order. The shadows in the room felt oppressive, like they were pressing down on me, but I forced myself to focus. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. that things started to get strange. I'd just returned from grabbing coffee in the break room when I noticed the door to 314 was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it before leaving. Pushing it open, I found the room exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The chair in the corner, which had been neatly tucked under the small side table, was now pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd bumped it earlier without realizing it. Maybe one of the cleaning staff had come in while I was gone. Either way, I wasn't about to let a chair spook me. I pushed it back into place and resumed my rounds. But as the night wore on, the unease grew. The shadows in the room seemed to ripple and shift, though the fluorescent light above Mr. Keller's bed was steady. And then there were the noises, soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, I thought it was the ventilator, or maybe the air conditioning, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. It sounded like a voice. Around 3:30 a.m., the monitors began to flicker. I was standing at the bedside, checking Mr. Keller's oxygen levels, when the ECG monitor briefly spiked, then flatlined, before returning to normal. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately checked his pulse. It was weak, but it was there. The ventilator continued to hiss and click rhythmically. "Stupid old equipment," I muttered, trying to calm myself. Bellevue's machines weren't exactly state-of-the-art, and glitches weren't uncommon. But as I stood there, watching the monitors, I felt it again, that oppressive, suffocating weight in the room, as if something unseen were watching me. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the monitor screen, just over my shoulder, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to blur and shift, as though it was never meant to be seen. My breath caught in my throat, and I whipped around, but the room was empty. The shadows in the corner seemed darker now, almost alive, writhing like ink in water. I backed out of the room, my hands trembling. I told myself I was imagining things. Exhaustion, caffeine, stress, it could all mess with your head. But deep down I knew better. I'd heard the stories. Every nurse who'd worked in 314 had a tale to tell. Whispers in the dark, objects moving on their own, patients who'd seen things no one else could. Mr. Keller woke briefly around 4 a.m., his eyes wide and glassy. He couldn't speak with the tube in his throat, but he gripped my wrist with surprising strength, his nails digging into my skin. His eyes darted to the corner of the room, and then back to me, pleading. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to soothe him. "You're safe." But his gaze remained fixed on the corner, and I swear, in that moment, I saw it again, the shadow. It wasn't just in the corner anymore. It was spreading, creeping along the walls like a living thing. The lights flickered, and Mr. Keller's grip on my wrist slackened. The monitors began to scream as his heart rate plummeted. I scrambled to call a code blue, but the phone wouldn't work. The screen was blank, as though the power had been cut. "Help!" I shouted, running into the hall. The crash cart was just outside, and I wheeled it in, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the defibrillator. But when I turned back to the bed, Mr. Keller was gone. The bed was empty. The ventilator tube was still in place, the straps undone as if someone had carefully removed it. The sheets were rumpled, but there was no sign of him. I froze, my mind racing. Patients don't just disappear. Even if he'd somehow managed to climb out of bed, impossible, given his condition, he couldn't have left the room without me seeing him. And then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from the corner. I turned, and there it was, the shadow no longer confined to the walls. It loomed over me, its form shifting and twisting, and for the first time, I felt a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I don't remember much after that. They found me in the hallway the next morning, sitting against the wall outside 314, clutching my knees to my chest. The room was empty when the morning staff arrived. No patient, no ventilator, no crash cart. It was as if none of it had ever happened. Mr. Keller's chart was gone, and when I asked about him, the charge nurse just frowned and said, "There's no record of a patient by that name." I transferred to a different floor after that. I couldn't bring myself to set foot in the ICU again, let alone room 314. But sometimes late at night, I think about the shadow and the way it seemed to reach for me like it wanted something. I wasn't even supposed to be on call that night. Another nurse had called out sick, and I got roped into the graveyard shift in the ICU. F this, but this wasn't the first time I'd pulled a double at Johns Hopkins, and it wouldn't be the last. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, like the kind of weight you feel before a thunderstorm rolls in. Still, I brushed it off and moved on. The ICU was calm, too calm actually. All of my patients were stable, and the monitors hummed their usual mechanical symphony. I figured it was going to be one of those rare nights where the hardest part of my shift would be staying awake. I was wrong. It started at 2:14 a.m. I remember the exact time because I happened to glance at the clock while refilling my coffee. The call came over the intercom, clear as day. Code Blue, room 327. Code Blue, room 327. The announcement jolted me into action. Room 327, it was one of mine. My heart raced as I grabbed the crash cart and bolted down the hallway, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. When I burst into the room, though, I stopped dead in my tracks. The bed was empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Room 327 was dark except for the faint glow of the monitors, which were all off. The bed was stripped, the sheets folded neatly at the foot. There was no patient. This didn't make sense. I'd checked my charts just an hour earlier. 327 had been unoccupied since the start of my shift. Must have been a mistake, I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. False alarms weren't unheard of, though they were rare. I wheeled the crash cart back into the hall and headed toward the nurse's station to double-check the record. "Hey, who called the code blue for 327? I asked Sarah, the charge nurse, who was typing away at the desk. She looked up at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" I frowned. "The announcement. Just now." Sarah shook her head. There wasn't any announcement. My stomach sank. I didn't want to argue with her. I could see from her expression that she thought I was imagining things. So I dropped it and went back to my rounds, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me. But the night wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., I was charting in one of the empty rooms when a soft knock echoed from the doorway. I turned, expecting to see Sarah or one of the residents, but there was no one there. "Hello," I called out, stepping into the hallway. It was empty. I felt a prickle of unease along the back of my neck and decided to take a quick walk around the unit. As I passed room 327, I glanced inside. The bed was still empty, but I swear I saw movement in the corner of my eye, just a flicker like someone ducking out of sight. I froze. "Is someone in there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response. Steeling myself, I stepped into the room and turned on the light. It flickered once before stabilizing, casting a harsh glow over the empty bed and the sterile white walls. And then I saw it. On the monitor, despite the fact that it wasn't hooked up to anything, there was a jagged green line. A heartbeat. I backed out of the room so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. "Sarah!" I shouted, running back to the nurse's station. She looked up, startled, as I skidded to a stop. "What's wrong?" she asked. 327, I stammered. There's something wrong with the room." She frowned, clearly annoyed, but followed me back down the hallway. When we stepped inside, the monitor was blank. "There's nothing here," she said flatly, crossing her arms. "Are you sure you're not just overtired?" I opened my mouth to argue, but then I stopped. She was right. What was I going to say? That I'd seen a ghost on the monitor? That the hospital itself had called a code blue? "I'm fine," I muttered. "Sorry for bothering you." But I wasn't fine. Far from it. The rest of the night dragged on, and the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I passed 327, I felt a pull like something, or someone, was trying to draw me inside. Just before the end of my shift, I decided to check the records. I needed to know if there was anything unusual about that room. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Room 327 had been the site of a patient death 3 weeks earlier, a man in his mid-40s who'd been brought in after a massive heart attack. He'd coded 3 times before they finally called it. The kicker? He died at 2:14 a.m. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night, not Sarah, not the other nurses, not even my family. But every time I pass by room 327 on my rounds, I feel the hair on my arms stand on end. And sometimes late at night, I think I hear the faint echo of the intercom. Code blue, room 327. You'd think I'd be used to the eeriness by now. Waverly Hills Sanatorium had been remodeled into a state-of-the-art facility, but no amount of fresh paint or polished floors could erase its history. I'd read all the stories before I started my contract here. How this place had once been a tuberculosis hospital where thousands of patients had died, how it was rumored to be one of the most haunted locations in America. But I didn't believe in that kind of thing. At least, not until I started working nights in the ICU. It was my 3rd shift in a row, and I was already running on fumes. I'd gotten assigned to room 502, situated in the far corner of the ward, down a hallway that no one liked to walk alone. The other nurses called it the cold room, and not because of the air conditioning. My patient, Ms. Lorraine Adams, was in her 60s and recovering from a serious bout of pneumonia. She was stable but restless. She kept saying she couldn't sleep because of the whispers. "They don't stop," she told me as I adjusted her 4-drip. Her voice was hoarse, her pale blue eyes wide with exhaustion. "They're in the walls, talking about me, watching me." I gave her the same reassurances I'd given countless patients before. "It's just the meds playing tricks on you," I said softly, patting her hand. "Try to rest. You're safe here." She didn't look convinced. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, the ICU was quiet except for the occasional beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of shoes against tile. I was charting at the nurse's station when I heard it for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was one of the other nurses talking down the hall, but when I looked up, the corridor was empty. The sound was so soft, I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I shook it off and went back to charting, but the whispers didn't stop. Over the next hour, they grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, an unintelligible murmur that raised the fine hairs on the back of my neck. I told myself it was nothing, just the old pipes in the building, or maybe the ventilation system, but deep down I knew better. Around 3 a.m., I went to check on Ms. Adams. As I approached room 502, I noticed the temperature drop. It wasn't just cold, it was frigid, like stepping into a freezer. My breath misted in front of me as I pushed the door open. Ms. Adams was sitting upright in bed, her frail hands clutching the blankets tightly. Her eyes were fixed on the far wall, and her lips were moving, though no sound came out. "Ms. Adams?" I asked, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" She turned to me slowly, her face pale and drawn. "They're in the walls," she whispered. "They're angry." I followed her gaze to the wall near the head of the bed. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it, a faint outline, as if something were pressing against the other side of the wall, trying to push through. I blinked, and it was gone. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, rising and falling like the tide. I could hear snatches of words now, my name, fragmented sentences, the occasional burst of laughter. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I wasn't the only one hearing it. Ms. Adams began screaming around 4 a.m., her frail body convulsing as she clawed at the walls. "Make them stop," she cried, her voice raw. "Please make them stop." I hit the call button for assistance, but the monitors in her room began to glitch, the lines on the screen spiking erratically. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room. And then, for just a moment, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. When the other nurses arrived, the room was still freezing. Ms. Adams had calmed down by then, though she refused to speak. The charge nurse, Denise, gave me a concerned look as we stepped into the hallway. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though my hands were shaking. "I think she's hallucinating," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Denise frowned. "Yeah, maybe. But 502, she trailed off, her expression unreadable. "What about it?" I pressed. She hesitated, then sighed. "That room's always been weird. Patients in 502 complain about the same thing, voices, shadows, cold spots. I don't know. Some of the older nurses say it's because of what happened here, back when this was still a sanatorium." I waited for her to continue, but she just shook her head and walked away. I stayed out of room 502 as much as I could for the rest of my shift, but the whispers followed me. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were burrowing into my skull. By the time my shift ended, I was ready to run out of the building. But as I passed 502 one last time, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was a voice, clear, deliberate, and cold. "Elena," it said. It knew my name. I turned and stared at the door, my heart pounding. The voice came again, sharper this time. "Elena, come in." I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, and the sound of my name echoed in my ears. The door creaked open slowly, though no one was on the other side. I didn't stay to see what was waiting for me inside. I quit my contract at Waverly Hills the next day. I told the agency it was because of the long hours, but the truth was, I couldn't handle what I'd experienced there. I've worked night shifts at Massachusetts General for nearly 5 years, but that particular stillness always unnerves me. That night started like any other. I was assigned to the ICU, and my patient load was light for a change. The usual sounds filled the ward, the rhythmic hiss of ventilators, the occasional beep of monitors, and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes against the linoleum floor. The first time I saw her, I thought she was just another sick patient. I was walking past room 416 when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was standing at the end of the hallway. She was wearing one of those old-fashioned hospital gowns, the kind we hadn't used in decades, her long dark hair hanging in messy strands over her shoulders. She was barefoot, her small feet pale against the cold floor. "Sweetie, are you lost?" I called out, stepping toward her. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked around the corner, her gown swishing softly behind her. I followed her, my sneakers squeaking slightly as I hurried to catch up. "Hey! Wait!" When I rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. I went back to the nurse's station and asked if anyone had seen a young girl wandering around. Sarah, the charge nurse, raised an eyebrow at me. "There shouldn't be any kids up here," she said. "You know that." "I know, but I saw her," I insisted. She was wearing a hospital gown. "Maybe she's from pediatrics." Sarah shook her head. "Pediatrics is on the other side of the hospital, and they're locked down at night. No way a kid could have wandered all the way here." I didn't argue, but her words didn't sit right with me. I knew what I'd seen. I kept an eye out for the girl during the rest of my shift, but she didn't appear again. By the time my shift ended, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been awake too long. Maybe the shadows in the hallway had played tricks on me. But then it happened again. The second time I saw her was 3 nights later. I was checking on a patient in room 411 when I noticed movement through the glass window in the door. The girl was standing in the hallway, staring directly at me. I froze. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were trying to figure me out. Her hair was damp this time, water dripping from the ends and pooling on the floor beneath her. I stepped toward the door, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner again. I followed her, calling out, but once again she was gone. I told Sarah about her the next day during our break. "Have you ever heard of a little girl wandering around the ICU at night?" I asked. Sarah put down her coffee and gave me a strange look. "You saw her, didn't you?" I blinked. "Wait, you've seen her?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, a few years ago. There's a story about her, an old one. Back in the 1960s, there was a girl who died up here. She was a long-term patient, something to do with her heart. Supposedly, she used to wander the halls at night because she couldn't sleep." "What happened to her?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Sarah leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She coded during the night shift. They say the nurses couldn't save her. Ever since then, people claim to see her wandering the ICU. And every time she shows up, someone dies. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill that crept up my spine. You're messing with me, right? Sarah didn't smile. You'll see, she said. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. I started dreading my night shifts, half expecting to see her every time I turned a corner or glanced down a hallway. And then, about a week after Sarah told me the story, it happened again. It was just after 3 a.m. when the monitors in room 413 started screaming. I rushed inside, finding my patient, an elderly man recovering from a stroke, thrashing weakly against the bed rails. His heart rate was spiking erratically, and his oxygen levels were plummeting. I called for help and started working to stabilize him, but something felt wrong. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, her head tilted, water dripping from her gown onto the floor. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice shaking. She didn't move. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. My patient died 20 minutes later. I told Sarah what had happened, but she just nodded grimly, as if she'd expected it. "It's always the same," she said. "Whenever someone sees her, someone else dies. I don't know why, but it's like she's connected to it somehow. Like she's a warning." I am a general physician working in a general hospital. Few stories. Too many older men, 40 years and older, falling accidentally on top of phallic objects and getting them stuck in their rectum. Objects like shampoo bottles, cucumbers, carrots, flashlights, aluminum cans, pan handles, PVC pipes, and dildos. Lady came by because she had weird smell and secretion coming from her vagina. No biggie. Start examining her when the stench of rotten fish hits me on my face. White grayish secretion flows out. Put my hand in there, reach deep, and pull out a dead fish. Lady plays with herself with fish, forgot to take it out. Too many ladies getting their tampons stuck way inside. Need help taking them out. 80-year-old man came in for a full physical. He disrobed and was wearing a leopard thong. Old dude acted like he didn't care. Could barely hold my giggles. One older woman, one younger woman, and one younger man come in for the same symptoms. Burning sensation on genitals. Explore them, all have chlamydia. I ask what's the deal. Younger woman is the wife, older woman is wife's mother. They both had sex with younger man, they're all okay with that. Weird family dynamic. Teenage boy came with genital bleeding. Examine him and see foreskin on penis slightly cut off. Saxon, what's with that? Answered. My current girlfriend won't have sex with someone with foreskin. Kid tried to circumcise himself. Schedule kid to have a professional circumcision. Hope he got laid. Scumbag tried to rob taxi driver at gunpoint. Scumbag doesn't know how guns work. Proceeds to shoot himself in the foot, and taxi driver proceeds to beat the shit out of him. I had to clean up the mess the taxi driver did to scumbag's face. Teen girl came crying cause she thought she was pregnant for giving oral to another girl. She thought she was pregnant from lesbian cunnilingus. Homeless man came in cause he felt ill. I don't judge, I'll treat him. Seems like a throat infection, no biggie. Leave office to get medication. Came back. No homeless man in office. A huge turd left in the sink. WTF, dude? 60-year-old, huge, hairy dementia patient running around the ER naked. Took 6 guys to pin him down while he was pissing himself. That was a weird day. I have more, these are the more recent ones. Because you guys asked for it, here are a few more stories. Some of these I didn't witness them, but I went around the hospital I'm working in to see what else happened here. Enjoy. 2 recovering drug addict Christian patients. You know which ones I'm talking about, verbally fighting, in a very Christian way in the ER. Their dialogue went something like, "May Christ heal you of all your illnesses, you piece of shit." "Yeah well, may God bless you." LOL what? Guy was peeing and pulled the zipper too quickly, got a sharp pain and blood on his penis. Goes to the ER. "Sure, I'll take a look. Not the first time I suture a patient that got his foreskin caught on the zipper. Foreskin is fine. He cut open the inferior part of the head of the penis. Looked like a peasy dispenser. Had to call vascular surgeon. Dementia patient screaming and throwing punches at anyone who comes near him. We tie him down. He somehow unties one of his hands and proceeds to fling his shit at the nurses. No one wants to go near him, obviously. He unties himself, grabs a tortilla and starts eating his shit off the floor. Floor was spotless after he was done. Diabetic construction worker came to the ER because he couldn't take off his right boot. Okay. Says he left his boots on cause it's easier to just sleep with them on and go to work. Take a look at the sole of his boot, and there's the head of a nail in there. We cut up the boot in different ways and find out the nail was impaled into his foot. He didn't feel a thing the whole week it was in there. Old lady came by with a dog covered in bumps. Flea bites? Ick, never had a pet, and says we should treat her dog. Specify to her that this is a hospital, not a vet's office. Even if I could treat the dog, I don't know if the medication/doses are right, and I could make it worse for her dog. She storms out the ER saying how useless doctors are. F you lady. In delivery room, attending a 20-year-old patient give birth. As she is pushing, she defecates, happens all the time, it's quite normal actually. As she's done evacuating and still pushing, a small little intestinal worm pops out. WTF do I do? Do I pull it out? Do I leave it dangling there? Whatever, receive baby and worm falls to poop bag. I was tempted to go to the patient, wrap her baby and the worm up, and present them. Here are your twins. They're both parasites. Hey Reddit. Long-time lurker, first-time poster. I don't even know where to start with this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. I'm an ICU nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, and something happened a few nights ago that I can't explain. I've seen a lot of weird things over the years, but this shook me. For context, I've been working night shifts for almost a decade. I'm used to the usual creepy hospital stuff, flickering lights, strange noises, patients talking to people who aren't there. It's just part of the job. But what happened in room 239 last week was on a whole different level. It started around 1 a.m. I'd just finished checking on one of my patients when the unit phone rang. It was the ER calling to let me know they were transferring a critical patient up to the ICU. The nurse on the line was frantic. She said the patient was in bad shape, and they'd need immediate care as soon as they arrived. I got the room ready, room 239. It's at the far end of the hallway, kind of isolated from the rest of the unit. I prepped the crash cart, set up the monitors, and waited. And waited. After about 15 minutes, I started to get annoyed. I called down to the ER to ask what was taking so long, but the nurse I spoke to just sounded confused. She said they hadn't sent anyone up to the ICU, and there was no record of a patient being transferred. I double-checked the patient board. Nothing. No name, no chart, no orders. At this point, I figured it was a mix-up. Maybe the ER nurse on the phone earlier was new or overwhelmed. It happens. I shrugged it off and went back to my rounds. That's when things got weird. Around 2 a.m., I walked past room 239 on my way to the supply closet. The door was open, which was strange because I was pretty sure I'd left it closed after prepping the room earlier. I peeked inside, and for a split second, I swore I saw someone lying in the bed. Just a shape under the sheets. I stopped and did a double take, but when I looked again, the bed was empty. The room was completely still. I laughed it off, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Night shifts can mess with your head, especially when you're running on caffeine and adrenaline. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a cold draft, even though the room's windows don't open. And then I heard it, a faint, raspy sound like someone struggling to breathe. I froze. My first thought was that maybe someone had been transferred without me knowing, but I checked the monitors. Everything was off. The bed was empty. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking a little. No response. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. The sound stopped. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I backed out of the room and closed the door, telling myself I was just overtired. About an hour later, the monitors in room 239 started going off. The alarms were blaring, the ECG showing flat lines and spikes like someone was coding. I sprinted down the hall, thinking someone must have snuck into the room, or maybe one of the other nurses had moved a patient without updating me. But when I got there, the bed was still empty. No patient, no equipment hooked up, just the monitors going wild. I turned them off, but they flickered back on. The ECG showed a heart rate, faint, irregular, but there. I felt this knot of dread in my stomach. It didn't make sense. The monitors weren't connected to anything. And then out of the corner of my eye I saw it. A shadow. It was standing near the window, just barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't shaped like a person exactly, more like an outline, tall and thin and wrong. I froze, my heart pounding. The shadow didn't move. It just lingered, watching. I don't know how long I stood there, but finally, I forced myself to back out of the room. I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on it, though. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The next day, I asked some of the other nurses if they'd ever had anything strange happen in room 239. Most of them just shrugged, but one of the older nurses, Carla, gave me this knowing look. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked. I blinked. "Saw who?" She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "The man in 239. He shows up every once in a while. No one knows who he is, but every time someone sees him, something bad happens." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "You're messing with me, right?" Carla didn't smile. "You'll see," she said. I couldn't shake what she'd said. A few days later, I decided to dig into the hospital's records. It took some time, but I eventually found a mention of room 239 in an old incident report. Apparently, about 10 years ago, a patient died in that room under unusual circumstances. He'd been brought in after a car accident, nothing too serious, just a broken leg and some cuts. He was supposed to make a full recovery. But one night, the nurses found him unresponsive. No warning, no explanation. And here's the creepy part. The night he died, the monitors in his room started going haywire about an hour before anyone realized something was wrong. Sound familiar? I haven't worked in room 239 since that night. I've swapped shifts, traded assignments, done whatever I can to avoid it. But sometimes, when I pass by, I swear I can feel someone watching me. And every now and then, late at night, the monitors in that room start beeping. Even when the bed is empty. So yeah, that's my story. I still don't know what to make of it. Part of me wants to believe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know it wasn't. If anyone else has had experiences like this, I'd love to hear about it. Misery loves company, right? Stay safe out there, night shifters. If you've ever worked at Cook County Hospital, you've probably heard the rumors about the 9th floor. It's the kind of story that gets passed around during night shifts, whispered in break rooms when the caffeine kicks in, and the exhaustion makes you brave enough to say it out loud. The 9th floor used to be part of the old tuberculosis ward decades ago, back when the hospital was overcrowded and underfunded. They say hundreds of patients died up there, and for whatever reason, the spirits never left. I always thought it was just that, stories. I'm not the superstitious type, really. I don't scare easily, and I've seen my fair share of creepy stuff working nights in the ICU. But what happened to me last year? Well, let's just say I don't laugh at the 9th floor stories anymore. It started with a maintenance request. The ICU was packed that night, and we were short-staffed, so I was already running on fumes when the charge nurse told me to take a patient chart up to the 9th floor. "They're doing some renovations up there," she said, handing me a clipboard. "Maintenance needs this for inventory." I groaned. The last thing I wanted to do was waste time running errands, but arguing wasn't going to help. The elevators at Cook County are ancient, and the ride to the 9th floor felt like it took forever. I could hear the cables creaking above me, and the fluorescent light in the elevator flickered the whole way up. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The 9th floor was empty. The renovations had been put on hold, so the floor was eerily quiet, with only a few flickering lights and plastic tarps covering the walls. The air smelled stale, like dust and old paint, and my footsteps echoed on the tile as I made my way to the supply room. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps coming from somewhere down the hall. I stopped and listened, my heart thudding in my chest. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the empty hallway. No response. I told myself it was probably just one of the maintenance guys. Maybe they'd forgotten something and come back to grab it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hurried to the supply room, dropped off the clipboard, and turned to head back to the elevator. As I walked past one of the old patient rooms, I glanced inside and froze. There was someone sitting on the bed. For a second, I thought it was a mannequin or some kind of equipment the maintenance team had left behind. But then the figure moved. It was a woman, dressed in a pale hospital gown, her back to me. Her dark hair hung limp and tangled around her shoulders, and she was hunched over like she was trying to catch her breath. "Ma'am," I said, stepping into the room. "Are you okay? You're not supposed to be up here." She didn't respond. I took another step closer, my pulse racing. "Do you need help? Are you lost?" The woman turned her head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, her skin a sickly gray, and her lips twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. And then she started laughing. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was low and guttural, like it was coming from somewhere deep in her throat. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my chest. My back hit the doorframe, and for a moment I couldn't move. The woman stood up slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Her grin never wavered as she took a step toward me. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached the elevator. I slammed the button repeatedly, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, but the hallway was empty. When the elevator doors finally opened, I jumped inside and hit the button for the ICU, my hands shaking. The ride down felt like an eternity, and I kept expecting the doors to open and find her standing there, grinning at me. When I got back to the ICU, I tried to tell Sarah, the charge nurse, what had happened, but she just laughed nervously. "You went to the 9th floor?" she said, shaking her head. "You're braver than me." I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd lost my damn mind. Over the next few weeks, I tried to forget about what I'd seen, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the hollow eyes, the twisted grin, the way she'd moved toward me like she wasn't fully human. I started asking around, trying to figure out if anyone else had experienced something similar. Most people just rolled their eyes or told me to get more sleep, but one of the older nurses, a woman named Gloria, gave me a strange look. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Gloria sighed and leaned in closer. "They say she was one of the TB patients back when this place was a sanatorium. She was young, maybe early 20s, and she'd been here for months. One night, she snapped, tried to strangle one of the nurses, then threw herself out the window in room 928. I swallowed hard. "But that room's sealed off now, isn't it?" Gloria nodded. "Yeah, but that doesn't stop her. People still see her wandering the 9th floor, especially at night. And sometimes they hear her laughing.